I'm acknowledging that shortly after the CARES Act of 2020 was announced, that Steve Mnuchin of the Department of Treasury was part of a press conference with, among others, the President of the United States, where they discussed how they were going to have a very serious and significant scrutiny of anybody that abused any money that was used through the CARES Act, especially in connection with any of the business assistance, and that there would be criminal prosecutions. As a matter of fact, I watched on TV a segment of Steve Mnuchin specifically discussing criminal prosecutions. We are not talking about recalibration of cost of doing business associated with a civil penalty. We're talking about criminal charges. This was when announced within a month, at the least, at the most, actually, of the implementation of the CARES Act. Now, if you recall, right after the CARES Act or right after the initial COVID 19 relief was offered, that there was a period of time during which it was understood that major financial institutions were going to be available to take loan applications from small businesses seeking some of the small business relief. And at that time, there was a specific decision that was made by Chase Bank to not be available to process applications on the day that they were officially allowed to begin to do so. Chase Bank, for whatever reason, waited over a weekend. And then after that, after at least 72 hours, after everybody else, all of the other major financial institutions agreed to start processing loan applications, only after 72 hours did Chase Bank begin to do so itself. Whatever ended up happening in the communications they had with their major shareholders was not put forward publicly, but there was a specific reason why they waited. And I bring this up because before COVID 19 and before the announcements around COVID 19, there was a congressional hearing before the Committee on Small Business by an organization identified as the Army Futures Command. Now, the Army Futures Command is, as I understand, at least allegedly, a specific but formal and official uh, area under the Department of the Army. It had been increasing its activities for several years. By July of 2019, it had discussed how it had increased its command up to 24,000 members. This was a very significant increase that had happened since the prior benchmark or the prior time frame it had declared, which was 2017. Within a very short period of time, it had increased its members substantially, or the what it identified as members of the command, up to 24,000. That was the specific metric that was used in the public releases of information from the Army Futures Command. The Army Futures Command has locations, offices specifically for the AFC, the Army Futures Command, in cities throughout the country. There are 3 offices in Texas. Its headquarters is located in Austin. What does it do? Well, in this report that was submitted to the Committee on Small Business with a letter specifically addressed to Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland, it discussed how it was engaged in a process of attempting to network with and work with small businesses throughout the country for a variety of defense related needs. It didn't go into details about what kind of businesses it was seeking to work with, what the process for engaging them was, what the standards were. As a matter of fact, in the report, it specifically said that at that time, it had no way to track the success of its relationship with these businesses. It had no internal controls when it came to evaluating what kinds of relationships it was going to have with these small businesses and whether or not they would have been determined to have met any sort of quality or any sort of other standards that would justify retention or would define other parameters around what that business operation was available to do. It also did not identify what the standards were for identifying small businesses with which to work. If you're a small business and you think somehow you might be interested in what they're doing, how do you apply? There was absolutely nothing in this report, a formal report, was presented to a Senate that gave any indication that they even had that as their primary interest. And the fact that they said specifically in this report that they had no way to follow up or track is a complete flagrant flouting of mandatory policy regarding contractors that the Department of Army and the rest of the military, including through the Department of Defense, has to meet. There are standards regarding contract procurement, as well as the maintenance or the maintaining of the contract, as well as any sort of cessation of contracting. These are very serious matters. There's more than one standard that the Army alone has when it comes to how to work with businesses, up to and including small businesses already. How is the Army Futures Command allowed to increase the membership in its command up to 24,000 members, and also at that time get away with presenting a report to the Senate that said they just had no intention and no way to track what was going to happen with these small businesses? Well, in April of last year, when the CARES Act was passed, one of the things, and I remarked on it publicly on one of my blogs, and I maintained it through public notices that I made on my YouTube feed, which is that in the CARES Act, in the actual specific allocation for the Small Business Administration, there's something very notable, which is that the cost associated with administration of the Small Business Administration is 3 times as much as the actual aid the Small Business Administration was going to be offering to small businesses. There was a 3-1 ratio when it came to small business aid. Why does the government need 3 times more for cost of administration of the Small Business Administration than what it intended to provide in aid to small businesses throughout this country? Now, after the CARES Act was implemented, and after there was the arrangement with the Department of the Treasury, including the announcement by Steve Mnuchin about criminal prosecutions for anybody that defrauded the small business elements of the CARES Act, there was also 2 other things that occurred. First were reports that companies that did not technically qualify as a small business were being availed of the assistance provided to small businesses through the CARES Act. But there was also an announcement that the Department of Treasury was going to be contracting with BlackRock in order to create bonds, junk bonds of bad corporate debt. What does that mean? I contend those things are absolutely related. And I am concerned that it is connected to the complete failure to appropriately thus far prosecute abuse of what is alleged to be relief in association with response to COVID-19 by major corporate actors, including major corporate actors that had already obligated themselves to substantial financial indebtedness prior to COVID-19 and are disabusing this pandemic response in order to try to exculpate themselves from any culpability that came with an intentional bad faith agreement to take on more obligation or debt than they ever intended to pay back. And in the meantime, what's happening is they're dumping their toxic debt through the federal government off onto the rest of us. Well, what if you were a small business owner prior to COVID-19? Or what if you were somebody that had every intention and was working toward establishing yourself as a small business owner, but for whatever reason kept getting obstructed? As I did. I came up with 3 formal business plans for incorporation in 3 different cities in 2 years, and was stolen from, defrauded, had my electronic account stolen from me, including my email accounts and blogs, as well as my Facebook account and my Twitter account. I was also in a process of attempting to run for political office. There's no preclusion against the small business owner running for political office. During this time, I had numerous electronic accounts stolen, and what I've seen is that when my accounts were stolen, the information in those accounts was allowed to be repurposed and distributed to other people, including people that used it for their business endeavors and including people that used it for their political campaigns, i.e., somebody was able to purchase a futures contract that was set up on my expropriated and stolen human capital so that they could engage it themselves as part of their future. This is what I mean when I say what I say about the Army Futures Command. I believe the Army Futures Command is a terrorist organization. I believe it is a domestic terrorist organization. I believe it is abusing its cover within the Department of Defense and disabusing and defrauding actual resources associated with the Department of the Army in order to attempt to extort or entice people within the United States to engage in knowingly illegal activities with an understanding that those who have access to the contracts set up through the AFC will somehow be able to leverage them abroad as part of some sort of covert operations or special operations scenario. I.e., you get your crew locally, come up with a little gig here domestically, and somebody in your network with the right connections is going to get that nice tender in Iraq or more recently, Pakistan. Maybe you're going to get one of those sweet deals in Libya. And it's especially lucrative and helpful if you are connected to an entity that works with a private security company, including people that might oversee your library, oversee your store, oversee your school. And what ends up happening is moments of domestic terrorism are leveraged and recirculated in order to increase the risk and offload it elsewhere in what materializes into an act of terrorism abroad. They had no reason to do this. This is not legitimate in any way, shape, or form. And the worst part is, my understanding is that, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, what they've done is they've escalated tactics they've already set up and tried to implement for the last 10 years, which is disabuse of the Department of Homeland Security and other acts of fraud that have happened at law enforcement agencies, both local and federal, especially in connection with kickback schemes to politicians who have prioritized legitimization and normalization of dangerous drugs as part of their political agenda, as opposed to actually moving forward on an appropriate political or economic paradigm that provides us with safety, stability, and prosperity. And in the meantime, there are very urgent issues globally we have to deal with. Climate change, food access, those are just two. Those are two everybody needs to deal with honestly. Now, if somebody decided they were going to leverage their global priorities, or rather market share in a particular sector, i.e. healthcare, who try to coerce a certain standard around climate change based upon depopulation as a corollary, and that depopulation agenda was supposed to correlate with an understanding of ideal demographics that should remain following the implementation of that depopulation regime. Well, I just spoke about it very directly and succinctly, didn't I? So too can they. That is not confidential information, and it's sure as hell not a trade secret that should be allowed to be copyrighted, especially if it came through a whistleblower report that was part of mandated reporting and or through an effort at establishing some form of public information so people can make informed decisions. But if that's what's going on, there's no justification for allowing a pseudo-alleged military organization to visit acts of domestic terrorism in order to create options in a very comprehensive hedging strategy that they may or may not broker with a large-scale investment firm that has assets in a variety of different contexts so that they can create moments of disturbance domestically, including ones that defraud localities that need financing for their activities, so that they can then offset it abroad in some act of domestic terrorism that destabilizes other countries that would otherwise be our allies, and then justifies xenophobia internally that supports an eugenicist agenda. This is what has been going on, and that is why Army Futures Command is a terrorist organization. There is no justification for it to be supported, and there certainly is no justification for it to be allowed to attempt to acquire options or take out loans on small businesses in this country in order to effectuate a pseudo-military agenda that thus far has not worked. If there was any legitimate reason, for instance, to be engaged with my LLC around anything that would have to do with what would be potentially an appropriate national security paradigm, why have not the appropriate agencies, in going on 5 years now, responded? I've made formal requests since June of 2017 to the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, and the Department of State, specific to certifications and industrial technologies I need for my LLC. Why were they allowed to be acquired as fraudulently issued securities to be disabused by alleged security actors engaging in acts of domestic terrorism and or aiding and abetting acts of international terrorism? That is what has happened. And in the meantime, they say, well, there's no way to keep track of our relationship. It's not true. They've absolutely kept track of their relationship with me enough to continue spying on me, interfering with my electronic communications, and harvesting me to farm out my human capital to other people using it as political risk insurance. That's not what it is. And I anticipate there are a variety of other people, numerous other people in this country, actual legitimate small business owners, including some with some very high level, potentially technical sophistication in terms of what their business operations would be, who might otherwise serve national security interests, including local national security interests, around making sure facilities in their community are safe, making sure that the water systems are safe, making sure their soil is safe, making sure that the bandwidth is safe from subliminal suggestion into engaging acts of racialized violence or sexualized violence. All of those are legitimate national security aims that small businesses in this country could be engaged. But it is defeating the purpose of actually addressing your own constituency when you allow for a pseudo-military organization to lie to Congress, get away with it, and then defraud the people for what? Who is flipping these futures? Why do we not have more regulatory oversight over what is happening on the futures market? Why are we not reining in abuse of derivatives? The Secretary of Treasury from when I was in high school was discussing abuse of derivatives. We're over 25 years later. Derivatives markets are trillions of dollars worth of commerce that is completely what? We have a lot of money that should be invested in the people because it was the people who created that value. You don't get to derivate it and then refuse to get back to us long enough to try to extort us with pseudo-military operations in our own country. It's not acceptable. I contend now that, unfortunately, the Army Futures Command is operating in a capacity that should identify it as a terrorist organization. And it's not the kind of thing where you allow for it to operate as a terrorist organization so you can inverse index it with legitimate activities people are doing through their small businesses in order to leverage it internationally in acts of actual terrorism in other countries that end up destabilizing them nationally and in other ways. Even if you get a good, lucrative contract for your humanitarian assistance, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that people that are engaged in legitimate healthcare, legitimate human services, legitimate childcare, legitimate food access issues in this country are extorted into agreeing to play along with some sort of pseudo-revolutionary undermining terrorista kind of situation so that a bunch of domestic terrorists in uniform can try to go get themselves a big score abroad. That's not acceptable.